In 1988, the Shroud of Turin was given a verdict. Not by a church council, not by a medieval chronicler, not by faith, doubt, or legend. By carbon-14. A small piece of linen was tested in 3 laboratories, and the result landed like a gavel. The cloth appeared to date from the 13th or 14th century. Not the time of Jesus, not 1st century Judea, the Middle Ages. For many, that should have ended the story, but it did not. The strange thing is not only what the test said. The strange thing is that the cloth survived the test, because after the headlines faded, after the numbers were printed, and after the word medieval seemed to settle over the case, the shroud did not disappear into a cabinet of solved frauds. It remained, studied, doubted, defended, dismissed, and returned to again. So tonight, we begin not with certainty, but with a contradiction, a scientific result that seemed decisive, and a mystery that refused to behave as if it had been solved. Before we venture further into the shadows, take a moment to subscribe, so you never miss a secret that history has tried to forget. And as we begin, leave a comment letting us know where in the world you are watching from tonight. It's a reminder of how far these forgotten echoes can reach. The Shroud of Turin is not just a relic. It is an argument made of linen, a surface where chemistry, devotion, medieval culture, textile history, and human longing have all left their fingerprints. To some, the carbon test condemned it completely. To others, it only opened a deeper question. What exactly had been tested, and what kind of history was woven into that tiny fragment? The decision to test the Shroud of Turin did not begin with the whole cloth. It began with a corner. That detail matters more than it first appears. When people hear that the shroud was carbon-dated, they often imagine the entire object somehow entered the machine of science, as if the linen itself had been weighed, measured, and judged in one complete act. But the reality was far smaller and much more delicate. A strip was cut from the cloth, not from the center, where the faint body image lies, not from the dramatic places where the stains have drawn centuries of attention. The sample came from an outer edge, near a corner, a place chosen, in part, because it would cause less visible damage to the relic. That was understandable. No one was going to remove a large piece from the middle of one of the most famous and controversial artifacts in Christianity. But from that moment, the entire case narrowed. The vast cloth, more than 4 meters long, with all its strange marks and woven history, was now represented by a fragment small enough to hold in the hand. That fragment was divided and sent to laboratories. Each lab worked independently. Each produced a result. And when the dates clustered in the medieval period, the conclusion seemed powerful because it came from more than one place. That is one reason the 1988 result carried such force. It was not a single lonely measurement, whispered from a back room. It was a coordinated scientific test, performed by recognized institutions, using a method designed to measure the age of organic material. To dismiss it casually would be dishonest. The carbon result deserves to be taken seriously. And yet, the storm began almost immediately because the test rested on a simple assumption, that the sample was representative of the whole cloth. That sounds reasonable. A piece of linen should be a piece of linen. If you cut a fragment from an ancient textile, and the fragment dates to a certain period, it is natural to think the textile belongs to that period as well. But relics are rarely so tidy. They are handled, folded, displayed, kissed, repaired, protected, burned, dampened, framed, unframed, and moved from one kind of human danger to another. They pass through hands that are reverent, careless, political, commercial, and desperate. A cloth that survives centuries is not just a cloth. It is a survivor of accidents. And the shroud had already survived plenty. The sample area became the eye of the storm, because critics argued that this corner might not have been a clean window into the original fabric. Perhaps it had been contaminated. Perhaps it had been strengthened after damage. Perhaps it had absorbed material over time. Perhaps it came from a section that had endured more handling than the rest. Or more controversially, perhaps it included fibers from a later repair. Each possibility changes the meaning of the test, not necessarily enough to overturn it. That must be said clearly. A disputed sample does not automatically make the cloth ancient. It does not magically move the shroud back to 1st century Jerusalem. It only forces a narrower question. Did the tested fragment truly speak for the whole object? This is where the debate becomes less like a courtroom verdict and more like an argument over evidence handling. Imagine a vast manuscript with one damaged corner. If the ink in that corner tests later than expected, you would not immediately assume the entire manuscript was created at that later date without asking whether the corner had been restored. You would examine the fibers, the stitching, the chemistry, the context. You would ask whether that corner has the same history as the rest. Supporters of the carbon dating result usually answer that the sample was selected with care and that the laboratories produced consistent medieval dates. That consistency matters. It makes the result difficult to wave away. Science is strongest when independent measurements point in the same direction. But critics look at the same process and see a vulnerability hiding inside that strength. If all 3 laboratories tested pieces from the same small region, then all 3 results may have repeated the same local problem. They were independent tests, yes, but not independent locations on the cloth. That is the hinge. The 1988 test did not test the entire shroud. It tested one selected area. The question is whether that area was ordinary or exceptional. And because the shroud is not just any textile, that question grew larger than the fragment itself. A few centimeters of linen became the battlefield on which chemistry, conservation, religious devotion, and historical skepticism all met. The irony is almost cruel. The test was meant to reduce uncertainty. Instead, it relocated uncertainty into a smaller and more technical place. Before 1988, people argued about the image, the blood, the gospel story, medieval forgery, and the long missing trail before France. After 1988, the argument became sharper. Not merely how old is the shroud, but what exactly did we date? For skeptics, the answer remains straightforward. The sample came from the cloth. The laboratories dated it. The medieval range fits the first secure historical appearance of the shroud in France. The simplest explanation is that the object itself is medieval. For defenders of an older origin, the sample corner became the crack in the wall, not proof of authenticity, but a place where the certainty of the verdict could be challenged. This is why the tiny sample matters so much. It is not because small samples are automatically unreliable. Carbon dating often works with very small amounts of material. The issue is not size alone. The issue is history. Where did the sample come from? What had that corner experienced? Was it untouched linen, or a complicated mixture of old and new? The shroud forces these questions because its story is not preserved in a clean laboratory chain. It passed through centuries of worship, fire, water, travel, display, and silence. By the time modern science reached it, the cloth had already lived many lives, and so the fragment cut in 1988 became more than a sample. It became a symbol of the entire mystery. A small piece asked to answer a question too large for certainty. A scrap of linen sharing the weight of one of the most disputed objects in the world. The result condemned the cloth. The sample made the verdict debatable. Carbon dating has a particular authority in the modern imagination. It sounds clean, numerical, almost immune to argument. A fragment of organic material is tested, the radioactive decay is measured, and the past produces a date. There is comfort in that. After centuries of legends, relic claims, pilgrim stories, and theological disputes, here at last seems to be something harder than opinion. And in the case of the Shroud of Turin, that hardness mattered. The 1988 result did not merely suggest a medieval date. It placed the tested linen roughly in the period when the shroud first appears with certainty in the historical record. That alignment was difficult to ignore. If a cloth shows up securely in 14th century France, and the tested fabric dates to the 13th or 14th century, skepticism does not need to work very hard. The pieces seem to fit. But the shroud has always been a problem of surfaces. The image lies on the surface. The stains sit on the surface. The handling, the smoke, the water, the repairs, the human contact. All of it belongs to a long history of surfaces. And carbon dating, for all its power, depends on whether the carbon being measured truly belongs to the original material and not to later additions that have become chemically or physically entangled with it. That is where the debate moved after 1988. Not into a simple rejection of science, though some tried to frame it that way. The more interesting dispute was narrower and more technical. Could the tested sample have contained carbon that did not belong to the original linen? Contamination is an easy word to say and a difficult one to prove. Every old object is contaminated in some sense. It has been touched by air, dust, moisture, skin, storage materials, microbes, and the ordinary stubborn dirt of time. But most contamination does not automatically ruin a carbon date. Laboratories know old materials are not pristine. They clean samples. They apply pre-treatments. They attempt to remove later substances before measurement. So the question is not whether the shroud had encountered contamination. Of course it had. The question is whether anything remained in the sample that could have shifted the date enough to matter. That is a much harder claim. The shroud had been through fire. In the 16th century, a blaze damaged the reliquary that held it, leaving scorch marks and burn holes that later became part of its visual identity. Water used in the aftermath also left stains. Smoke and heat are not poetic details here. They are part of the object's physical biography. To a viewer, those scars make the cloth feel older, more dramatic, almost wounded. To a scientist, they raise practical questions. Could fire products have altered the chemistry of the linen? Could smoke have introduced newer carbon? Could water have moved contaminants deeper into fibers? Could centuries of exposure have created a skin of material that resisted cleaning? These questions are legitimate to ask. They are not all equally persuasive. Fire does not simply reset a carbon date like turning back a clock. Smoke contamination would need to be significant, persistent, and not fully removed by cleaning. Water stains may carry material, but the scale of the shift required is large. Moving a genuinely first-century cloth into a medieval date is not a small adjustment. It would require enough younger carbon to overwhelm the older signal in a measurable way. That is why the contamination debate lives in a difficult middle ground. It cannot be dismissed as absurd because old textiles are chemically complicated. But it also cannot be accepted as an escape hatch merely because the result is inconvenient. Then there are microorganisms. On paper, the idea is simple. Bacteria, fungi, or other biological growths may have lived on the fibers, adding carbon from a later period. A living film, invisible or nearly invisible, could become part of what was tested. If the laboratory measured both old linen and newer biological material, perhaps the date would shift forward. Again, the idea has a certain appeal because it respects the object's long life. A relic is not sealed in a vacuum. It breathes with its environment. It travels through damp chapels, storage chests, processions, and display conditions that would make any conservator nervous. But appeal is not proof. For microbial contamination to rescue an ancient date, the amount of added material would have to be substantial. Not a faint trace, not a symbolic presence, enough to alter the measured carbon balance. And if that much biological material were present, one might expect it to leave clearer physical or chemical evidence. The shroud debate often turns on this kind of threshold. A possibility is not the same as a probability. A mechanism is not the same as a demonstrated event. And an objection to a test is not automatically a better explanation than the test itself. This is where the most careful researchers, on either side, tend to sound less dramatic than the public debate around them. They do not say, "The test proves everything forever," or "The test means nothing." And they ask about sample selection, cleaning procedures, fiber composition, environmental history, and whether any proposed source of error is large enough to explain the result. That last phrase matters. Large enough, because the carbon test did not need to be slightly wrong for the shroud to be ancient. It would have to be wrong by more than 1,000 years. That is not impossible in the abstract, if the sample were badly unrepresentative or heavily altered. But it is not something one should assume lightly. The deeper issue is that the shroud is not merely a sample in a lab report. It is an object with a reputation. And reputations distort interpretation. For believers, every uncertainty in the carbon test may feel like a door reopening. For skeptics, every proposed complication may sound like special pleading. Both reactions are human. Neither is enough. The honest position is less satisfying. The carbon result remains one of the strongest pieces of evidence for a medieval origin. It is direct, measurable, and consistent with the shroud's secure appearance in the historical record. But the conditions surrounding the sample have kept the result from becoming the clean ending many expected. The cloth was not a neutral object pulled from dry soil and tested before anyone had reasons to care. It was a damaged, revered, handled, repaired, smoke-marked textile whose exact material history is still argued over. That is why, after 1988, carbon was no longer the final answer for everyone. Not because carbon dating had failed as a science, but because one powerful result had collided with an artifact whose past was physically messy, emotionally charged, and historically incomplete. The test gave a date. The cloth asked what, exactly, had been dated. The repair theory begins with a very human problem. Old cloth tears. It weakens at the edges. It frays where hands touch it most. It suffers most not in the grand center, where everyone is careful, but along corners and borders, the very places meant to be gripped, folded, stitched, and secured. If a textile is displayed again and again, century after century, the edges become the front line of damage. So when critics of the 1988 carbon test looked at the sample location, they asked a question that sounded simple, almost practical. What if that corner was not entirely original, not replaced completely, not obviously patched like a square sewn onto a torn shirt? Something subtler. A repair worked into the cloth with enough skill that the newer fibers blended into the older linen. A technique sometimes described as invisible reweaving, or at least a form of textile restoration that might not be obvious at a glance. The appeal of the theory is clear. If the tested area contained a mixture of older linen and later repair material, the carbon date could be pulled forward. The laboratories would not have dated the shroud as a whole. They would have dated a compromised corner, a small region carrying a younger history than the rest of the cloth. It is an elegant answer, perhaps too elegant. That is both its strength and its danger. Because the repair theory does something emotionally powerful. It rescues the mystery at the exact point where it seems most threatened. It takes the strongest evidence for a medieval origin and places a question mark around the sample itself. For those who believe the shroud may be older, this is not a minor technical objection. It is the doorway through which the entire debate re-enters the room. But the weakness is just as important. A theory that explains away the most inconvenient evidence must be held to a high standard. It cannot survive only because it is possible. It must show that the sample area was actually different in a way significant enough to alter the date. It must demonstrate not just repair, but repair of the right kind, in the right place, with enough later material to matter. That is a much heavier burden. There are old textiles with patches. There are old textiles with strengthened borders. There are restorations so clever that casual observers miss them. None of that proves this particular sample was altered. The shroud is not a general example of textile conservation. It is one object, with one test location, and the question must be answered there. This is where the debate becomes unusually tense, because both sides can accuse the other of wanting the evidence to behave. Skeptics see the repair theory as a convenient escape route. The carbon result was clear. It matched the medieval historical record. Then, after the result became uncomfortable, critics focused on the sample and proposed that it might not count. From that perspective, the repair theory looks less like discovery and more like negotiation with reality. But defenders see something different. They argue that the sample location was precisely the kind of area where hidden complexity would be expected. An outer corner exposed to handling and possible reinforcement. To them, ignoring that possibility is not scientific caution. It is overconfidence. And both instincts are understandable. The most interesting part of the repair theory is not simply whether it is true. It is what it reveals about how people handle evidence when the stakes are high. When a test confirms what someone already suspects, the test looks clean. When it challenges a cherished possibility, every condition surrounding that test becomes important. This is not always dishonesty. Sometimes it is exactly how good investigation works. You examine assumptions. You question sampling. You look for contamination. You ask whether the material was uniform, but sometimes it becomes something else, a way to keep a beloved uncertainty alive, long after the simplest explanation has taken the lead. The shroud lives in that uncomfortable space between scrutiny and special pleading. A repaired corner would make the carbon date less decisive. It would not automatically make the shroud authentic. It would not prove a first-century origin, or identify the image, or close the historical gap. It would only remove one large obstacle. The rest of the case would still have to be built. That distinction often gets lost. People speak as if weakening the medieval carbon date would prove the opposite. It would not. In historical mysteries, evidence does not work like a scale with only two sides. If one explanation loses strength, another does not automatically become true. The shroud could be medieval. It could be older. It could be a medieval object incorporating older traditions. It could be something made in a context we do not yet understand. A damaged sample would reopen the case, not solve it. And if the repair theory is false, then it may be one of the most revealing excuses in the modern history of relic studies. Not because everyone who considers it is foolish. They are not. The question of textile alteration is legitimate. But if the sampled corner was essentially original, then the theory becomes a cautionary tale about mystery itself. A single technical possibility can expand until it feels like a rival verdict. A narrow doubt can become, in the public imagination, a full acquittal. That is how old objects survive modern conclusions. They do not always defeat the evidence directly. Sometimes they gather uncertainty around the evidence until certainty begins to look rude. There is a strange fairness in admitting both possibilities. If the corner was altered, then the 1988 result may have dated the wrong material, or at least a mixed material. That would be a serious problem for anyone treating the carbon date as final. If the corner was not altered, then the medieval date stands with even greater force, and the repair theory becomes less an answer than a mirror, reflecting how badly some people need the shroud to remain unresolved. The cloth itself offers no confession. It does not tell us where every fiber came from. It does not label its original threads and its later ones. It only presents a woven surface, damaged and guarded, carrying just enough ambiguity to keep the argument alive. And perhaps that is why the repair theory has such staying power. It is not the most dramatic claim attached to the shroud. It does not require secret orders, hidden manuscripts, or a master forger laughing across the centuries. It asks only for a needle, a damaged corner, a careful repair, and a test that trusted one small fragment too much. That modesty makes it persuasive. It also makes it dangerous, because sometimes the most believable escape hatch is still an escape hatch. To understand why the Shroud of Turin remains so difficult to place, you have to step away from the image for a moment. That is not easy. The eye wants to return to the face, to the long, faint body, to the marks that have made the cloth famous. The image is what arrests people. It is what pilgrims came to see, what skeptics came to explain, what photographers and scientists returned to again and again. But before the image, before the blood debates, before the carbon result, there is something more basic. There is linen, and linen has a memory of its own. A woven cloth is not just a neutral background. It is a record of decisions. How the flax was prepared, how the threads were spun, how tightly they were made, how the loom was set, how much skill and time someone was willing to spend. Every thread is part of a technical language, and unlike a written document, linen does not try to persuade you. It simply reveals, under close attention, what kind of hands and tools made it possible. The shroud is woven in a distinctive 3-to-1 herringbone twill. That phrase can sound dry, almost like something hiding in a museum catalog. But it is one of the most important material facts about the cloth. In a simple weave, threads pass over and under one another in a plain alternating pattern. Practical, efficient, common. But herringbone twill is more elaborate. It creates a broken diagonal pattern, a repeated shift in direction that gives the surface a subtle chevron effect. In the case of the shroud, the pattern is not merely decorative. It tells us the cloth required planning, a more complex loom setup, and a weaver who knew how to produce a refined textile. This is where textile evidence becomes historical evidence, because weaving is never only about taste. It belongs to an economy. It belongs to available technology. It belongs to trade networks, skill traditions, and the social world of the people who could afford the finished product. A rough burial cloth and a finely woven linen sheet do not say the same thing. They may both wrap a body, but they come from different levels of labor and value, and the shroud's weave has long made scholars and observers ask whether it fits more naturally in one period than another. This is not as simple as saying, the weave is ancient, or the weave is medieval. That kind of certainty would be too easy and probably too careless. Textile techniques can last for centuries. Patterns can move across regions. Skilled workshops can preserve older methods or revive them. A cloth made in one place can travel far from its origin. And expensive fabrics are especially dangerous as evidence because luxury moves. It gets traded, gifted, looted, inherited, and reused. Still, weave matters. The fineness of the linen suggests an object made with care. The threads are not random. The structure is not crude. Someone invested skill into producing this cloth, whether in antiquity, the medieval Mediterranean, or some later workshop drawing on older traditions. That alone complicates the popular image of the shroud as either a simple grave sheet or a crude medieval fraud. A crude fraud is one thing. A carefully made textile is another. If the shroud was created as a medieval relic, then it was not painted on a cheap rag pulled from the nearest market stall. It was made, or chosen, on a fabric that could carry authority. That point matters. Medieval relic culture was not always careless. People in the Middle Ages were capable of sophistication, deception, devotion, and artistry all at once. The fact that a cloth is technically impressive does not remove it from the medieval world. If anything, it may place it inside a culture that understood the persuasive power of beautiful materials. But if the cloth is older, the weave also creates questions. Could such a textile have existed in the ancient Near East? The answer is not impossible. Ancient textile production could be highly skilled. The idea that people 2,000 years ago were incapable of fine weaving is a modern laziness, a way of mistaking age for primitiveness. Ancient artisans did not lack intelligence. They lacked some later industrial tools, but not patience, technique, or refinement. The better question is not whether ancient people could weave well. The better question is whether this specific structure, quality, and scale fit the known textile environment of the time and place being proposed. That is a subtler investigation, It asks about comparable examples. It asks about burial customs. It asks whether a 3-to-1 herringbone linen of this kind would have been common, rare, plausible, or extraordinary. It asks not only, could this have been made, but who would have owned it, and under what circumstances would it have ended up around a corpse? The shroud forces us to be careful, because material evidence can be tempting in both directions. A believer may look at the weave and see ancient dignity. A skeptic may look at the same weave and see medieval craftsmanship. Both may be reading more into the threads than the threads are willing to say. What the fabric can tell us is narrower but valuable. It tells us the shroud is not materially trivial. It belongs to the world of skilled textile production. Its pattern and fineness deserve serious attention. It tells us that the cloth's history cannot be reduced to an image alone, because the image sits on a textile that already had a story before anyone saw a body upon it. And perhaps that is the most overlooked point. The shroud is often treated as if its mystery begins with the figure. But someone first made the linen. Someone harvested flax, prepared fibers, spun thread, arranged the loom, and produced a long, carefully structured cloth. Before the face appeared, before the relic was displayed, before the laboratories weighed carbon atoms, the object was already the result of human labor. That labor leaves a signature, not a signature like a name at the bottom of a painting, more like the accent in a voice. It does not tell you everything about where the speaker came from, but it narrows the possibilities. It hints at training, region, habit, and class. It can mislead if heard too confidently, but ignored completely, it leaves the investigation half blind. The carbon test gave the shroud a date range. The linen asks for a workshop. And the search for that workshop leads us into a more uncomfortable question. If this cloth was meant for a poor man's tomb, why does it look like something far more costly? The phrase, burial cloth, can mislead us. It sounds humble, plain, almost disposable. A length of linen placed around a body, used once, then sealed away with the dead. In the imagination, it belongs to poverty and grief. Something simple, purchased in haste, handled by mourners who had more sorrow than money. But the Shroud of Turin does not quite behave like that kind of cloth. Its weave is refined. Its scale is substantial. Its structure suggests labor and cost. And that creates a quiet but serious problem for anyone who wants to place it directly inside the burial world of first-century Judea. Not an impossible problem, but a problem. The question is not whether fine linen existed in antiquity. It did. Ancient textile production could be remarkably sophisticated. Wealthy households, temples, courts, and trade networks all moved textiles of high value. Linen was not merely a practical fabric. It could be a sign of status, purity, ritual care, and economic power. A finely woven cloth in the ancient world was not a casual object. It represented time, and time in textile production was money. So when we look at the shroud as a physical fabric, we have to ask not only could such a cloth have existed, but who would have used it for burial? That is where the social reality becomes important. The man traditionally associated with the shroud is not imagined as wealthy. The gospel setting is one of urgency, political violence, and a burial carried out under pressure before the Sabbath. In that scene, the body is not being prepared in a long royal ceremony. It is being placed in a tomb quickly, under tense circumstances, by people whose actions are shaped by danger, time and religious obligation. A costly linen does not automatically contradict that setting. According to the Gospel narratives, the tomb involved a figure of some means, Joseph of Arimathea, and that matters. A wealthy supporter could have provided a better cloth than the dead man's own social status would suggest. In that sense, the poor man's tomb argument can be overstated, but it cannot be ignored either, because historical plausibility is not the same as narrative possibility. A story can explain how an expensive cloth reached a crucified man's burial. The material evidence still asks whether this particular fabric fits that world in a natural way, or only with special explanation. That is a different standard. A simple linen burial shroud in 1st century Judea would not surprise anyone. A large, finely woven herringbone cloth invites more scrutiny. It begins to look less like an ordinary funerary object and more like an exceptional textile pressed into funerary use. Possible, but not something we should treat as automatically expected. This is where many discussions of the shroud become too eager. One side may say, a poor man would never have been buried in such a cloth, as if ancient burial practice obeyed modern assumptions about neat social categories. The other side may answer, a rich disciple could have supplied it, as if that removes every difficulty. Both responses are too fast. The better approach is slower. 1st century Judea was not a world without fine textiles, nor was it a world where every burial looked the same. Customs varied by status, region, family, urgency, and religious practice. A burial cloth could be simple or more costly. Tomb burial itself could imply resources. Objects used in death were not always identical to what the deceased used in life. But if the shroud's cloth was unusually fine, then it tells us something. Whoever made or selected it was not thinking only in terms of the cheapest possible covering. The cloth had value before it became a relic, before it became an image, before anyone argued over carbon atoms. That value changes the story. It reminds us that the shroud, if ancient, would not simply be evidence of a death. It would be evidence of a very particular burial circumstance, a body associated with sudden execution, but wrapped in material requiring skill and expense. That combination is not impossible. It is precisely the kind of contradiction that can happen in history, where political violence and private devotion meet in the same hour. A condemned man may die like a criminal and be buried through the resources of someone with influence. That is not fantasy. History is full of such uneven endings. Still, the cloth resists becoming a perfect fit. The more refined the textile, the more we must ask whether we are looking at a burial object from the 1st century or a later fabric chosen because it looked worthy of holiness. Medieval Europe understood this instinct very well. Sacred objects were not expected to look ordinary. They were framed, covered, embroidered, elevated, and surrounded with materials that taught the viewer how to feel before they taught the viewer what to think. A fine linen carrying the image of Christ would have been powerful in a medieval setting, not despite its refinement, but because of it. This is one reason the textile evidence cuts both ways. In an ancient context, the weave may suggest access to quality and unusual burial circumstances. In a medieval context, the same refinement may suggest deliberate selection. A relic meant to command awe would not need to be crude. It would need to be convincing. And in a world trained to read sanctity through material beauty, the right cloth could do half the work before the image even entered the story. This does not mean the shroud was made as a medieval forgery. It means the cloth's quality does not rescue it from the medieval explanation. Medieval makers and patrons were not technically helpless. They were capable of obtaining fine textiles, especially through trade networks connected to the Mediterranean and the East. The old habit of imagining medieval Europe as clumsy and primitive has done serious damage to this debate. A medieval origin does not require a cartoonish forger with a bucket of paint and a cheap sheet. If anything, the shroud, if medieval, would have emerged from a world far more sophisticated than that. A world of workshops, relic economies, devotional images, noble patrons, and churches competing for spiritual gravity. A world where textiles traveled, where imported fabrics carried prestige, where the boundary between devotion and deception could become dangerously thin. And if ancient, then the cloth still asks us to imagine a burial that was not ordinary. Hurried yet costly, violent yet carefully attended, socially humiliating yet touched by someone with means. That is what makes the fabric so revealing. It does not simply tell us whether the shroud is real or false. It tells us what kind of story each possibility demands. A cheap cloth would make the ancient burial scenario easier in one way, but perhaps less striking. A fine cloth makes it more difficult, but also more human. Grief does not always spend according to logic. People do extravagant things around death. They use what they have. They borrow status from objects when dignity has been stripped from a body. And that may be the most honest way to hold the question. The shroud is too refined to be treated as an ordinary poor man's covering, but it is not too refined to have existed in the ancient world, nor too refined to have been used in an exceptional burial. Its quality neither proves nor disproves the traditional claim. It only raises the cost of explanation. And when the cost of explanation rises, history becomes more interesting. Because now we are no longer asking whether linen could wrap a body. We are asking who had access to this kind of linen, why it was chosen, and whether its craftsmanship belongs more naturally to a tomb in antiquity or to a later age that knew exactly how powerful a sacred cloth could become. The medieval explanation is often treated too casually. People hear medieval and imagine something crude, a dim workshop, a clumsy painter, a relic produced for gullible crowds by someone who barely understood anatomy, chemistry, or textile craft. It is a comforting image for skeptics because it makes the shroud easier to dismiss. It is also unfair to the Middle Ages. The medieval world was not simple. It was capable of delicate metalwork, stained glass that still burns with color after centuries, illuminated manuscripts of astonishing precision, complex architecture, luxury textiles, and devotional objects designed with deep psychological intelligence. Medieval people did not lack skill. They lived in a different world of assumptions, but not a world without technique. So if the shroud belongs to the 13th or 14th century, as the carbon dating suggests, the question is not, could a medieval person make something impressive? Of course they could. The better question is, could a medieval workshop, somewhere in Europe or the Eastern Mediterranean, produce a linen cloth like this? And could that cloth then become the carrier of an image powerful enough to be mistaken for, or promoted as, a burial relic of Christ? That question is much more interesting. By the High Middle Ages, Europe was not isolated from the wider textile world. Fabrics moved through trade. Linen, silk, wool, and mixed luxury textiles crossed regions through merchants, noble households, monasteries, church treasuries, and the spoils of war. The Eastern Mediterranean, Byzantium, Italy, France, and other regions were connected by roots of commerce and devotion. A cloth did not have to be woven in the same place where it was later displayed. That matters because the shroud's weave has often been discussed as if it must point to one neat origin. But textiles travel. Fine textiles travel especially well because they are valuable, portable, and easy to reuse. A high-quality cloth could be purchased, gifted, inherited, cut, stored, or repurposed long after it left the loom. A 3-to-1 herringbone weave, then, does not automatically remove the shroud from the medieval period. The technique required skill, but the medieval world had skilled weavers. The pattern was refined, but refinement was not unknown. The cloth was large, but large textiles existed, especially where money and patronage made them possible. The real issue is not capability alone. It is fit. Does the fabric fit the medieval world naturally? In some ways, yes. A fine linen connected to a major devotional object would make sense in a period when relics held enormous religious, political, and economic power. Churches wanted objects that drew pilgrims. Noble patrons wanted association with sacred history. Communities wanted tangible links to the divine. A cloth believed to bear the image of Christ's body would not merely be spiritually important. It could transform the status of the place that held it. In that world, choosing a fine textile would not be an accident. It would be strategy, reverence, or both. A sacred image on rough cloth might still move people, but a sacred image on a refined linen would carry a different authority. It would feel worthy. It would seem preserved rather than improvised. It would invite careful display. And medieval viewers were trained to read holiness through materials. Gold leaf, silk, polished reliquaries, embroidered vestments, painted panels, carved ivory, and luminous glass. To modernize, authenticity often means plainness. We imagine the true thing as humble, stripped of ornament, almost reluctant to impress. Medieval devotion did not always work that way. Beauty could be evidence of honor. Expense could be a form of worship. A costly object could be made sacred not by hiding its value, but by offering that value to God. This is why the shroud, if medieval, does not need to be treated as a cheap trick. It could have emerged from a culture where the lines between art, devotion, relic, and persuasion were far more fluid than we like to admit. A maker might have intended deception. A patron might have believed in the object sincerely. A community might have inherited a story without knowing how it began. Over time, uncertainty could harden into tradition. That is not conspiracy. That is history behaving normally. Still, there is a difficulty for the medieval explanation. If a 13th or 14th century workshop made the shroud as an image, the method remains strangely elusive. The textile itself may fit the period. The historical appearance in France may fit the period. The carbon result certainly points there. But the body image does not look like ordinary medieval painting in a simple way. And that is where the argument changes shape. A medieval date may explain the cloth's first secure appearance. It may explain the textile environment. It may explain the relic culture that gave such an object meaning, but it does not automatically explain how the image was formed. This is a common mistake in the debate. One side says, the carbon dating proves it is medieval, as if that also proves the image-making technique. The other side says, the image is mysterious, as if that defeats the carbon dating. Neither move is careful enough. Objects can be medieval and still technically puzzling. A medieval artifact does not have to be crude or obvious. It can be sophisticated, experimental, even difficult to reproduce. The Middle Ages included artists and artisans who worked with heat, pigments, binders, acids, molds, reliefs, pressure, dyes, and methods that may not map neatly onto modern categories. Not every workshop left a manual. Not every process survived in written form. And not every medieval image was made with the same tools used for panel painting or manuscript illumination. So when we ask whether the Middle Ages could have made it, the answer has to be layered. Could the Middle Ages produce fine linen? Yes. Could the medieval world generate a powerful relic claim around a burial cloth of Christ? Absolutely. Could such an object appear in 14th century France and gather devotion, controversy, and institutional attention? That fits the period very well. Could a medieval maker create the shroud image exactly as we see it, with all its unusual surface qualities? That remains harder to say. And perhaps that is the most important point. The medieval explanation is strong because several lines of evidence lean in that direction. The carbon date, the secure historical appearance, the relic culture, and the plausibility of skilled textile production. But it is not complete simply because it is strong. It still has to account for the object as a whole. The danger for skeptics is overconfidence. The danger for believers is selective doubt. A skeptical reading should not pretend that medieval people were incapable of technical subtlety. A believing reading should not pretend that the medieval context is irrelevant just because the image is strange. Both sides often flatten the past to protect a conclusion. The shroud resists that flattening. It asks us to imagine a medieval world intelligent enough to make something extraordinary and complicated enough to believe in it after it was made. It asks us to consider that a relic need not begin as a criminal plot. It might begin as art, devotion, experiment, ambition, misunderstanding, or some combination that no surviving document fully records. And that possibility is unsettling in its own quiet way. Because if the Middle Ages could have made the cloth, then the mystery does not vanish. It moves from the tomb to the workshop. The image is the reason the shroud could never remain only a textile. Without it, the cloth might still be interesting. A fine linen with a disputed date, a damaged history, and a possible trail through medieval Europe would deserve study, but it would not hold the world's attention in the same way. It would not draw pilgrims, skeptics, chemists, photographers, historians, and theologians into the same uncomfortable room. The image changes everything. It is faint. That is one of the first surprises. Many people expect something bold because the controversy is bold. They imagine a clear portrait, almost painted for the eye. But the body image on the shroud is subdued, low in contrast, more like a presence discovered than a picture announced. It does not behave like an ordinary devotional painting made to command attention from a distance, and under examination, the strangeness becomes more specific. The image appears to rest on the uppermost surface of the linen fibers. It does not seem to soak deeply into the threads in the way many paints, dyes, or stains might. It is often described as extremely superficial, not simply on the cloth, but on the outer surface of individual fibers. That detail has become one of the central puzzles of the shroud, because if the cloth is medieval, then a medieval person still had to make the image. That sounds obvious, but it is often skipped over too quickly. A medieval date answers one question. When the tested material appears to belong, it does not, by itself, explain the technique. A forgery is still a made object. Someone has to decide how to produce it. Someone has to know or stumble upon a process that leaves behind the result we see. An ordinary painting explanation has always had difficulty here. Paint tends to have body. It leaves particles, binders, brush behavior, penetration into fibers, uneven deposits where the hand moved, where liquid gathered, where pigment clung. If a medieval artist painted a full-body image onto linen, one would expect certain traces of that act. Not necessarily obvious to the naked eye after centuries, but detectable in ways that match known artistic methods. The shroud image does not fit that expectation comfortably. That does not mean it is supernatural. It means the simplest image-making explanation has to work harder. And when an explanation has to work harder, the mystery deepens. Not because we are abandoning science, but because science becomes more demanding. Several possibilities have been proposed over time. Some have imagined contact methods, where a body or relief was placed against the cloth. Others have suggested heat, chemical reactions, vapors, pigments applied in unusual ways, or combinations of techniques. Each proposal tries to solve the same problem: how to create a faint, body-shaped image that appears so shallow on the fibers and yet carries enough visual information to be recognizable. But each solution brings its own difficulties. A direct contact image might explain surface transfer, but contact usually distorts. A cloth laid over a three-dimensional body does not produce a neat, undistorted human figure. It wraps, bends, stretches, folds, and changes distance from the skin. Faces become widened. Bodies become strange. Anyone who has ever pressed fabric against an object and then flattened it knows the problem. 3 dimensions do not politely become 2. A painted image can be controlled, but then the surface chemistry and lack of obvious penetration become harder to explain. Heat can discolor linen, but controlling heat over a large human form without producing obvious scorching patterns is not a small task. Chemical vapor theories can sound elegant, but they must explain the precision, the distribution, and the survival of the image over time. The shroud sits there, refusing to be reduced. This is why the image has such power in the debate. It allows both caution and imagination to live side by side. The carbon dating may push us toward the Middle Ages, but the image asks what kind of medieval process could have produced it. The textile may fit a skilled workshop, but the image does not announce a workshop's ordinary habits. The historical record may begin securely in France, but the visual object seems older in mood than its first documents. That last point is dangerous, of course. An object seeming old is not proof that it is old. Atmosphere is not evidence. A faint image can feel ancient simply because it is faded. A sacred face can feel timeless because viewers bring centuries of expectation to it. We must be careful not to mistake emotional force for historical data, but neither should we dismiss the image as unimportant merely because the carbon date is inconvenient to tradition. A medieval shroud with a mysterious image remains a serious historical object. It would reveal a lost or poorly understood technique, or an unusual experiment in relic making, or a devotional process more sophisticated than we have credited. That alone would make it extraordinary. The more one studies the shroud, the less satisfying the word fake becomes. not because the cloth must be authentic, but because fake is too thin a word for what may have happened. It suggests a simple act of fraud, a deliberate trick, a person making a false thing and presenting it as true. That may be part of the story, but the physical object hints at something more complicated. Craft, accident, belief, interpretation, preservation, and later meaning accumulating around a surface that no one has fully explained. The image is the point where the debate escapes the courtroom. Carbon dating gives a verdict. Textile analysis gives a context. Historical records give a first secure appearance. But the image asks a different kind of question. Not only when, but how. And how can be the more stubborn question. If the shroud is medieval, then the Middle Ages produced an image whose method still provokes modern argument. If it is older, then the image becomes even more difficult, because it would have survived not only time, but every opportunity for misunderstanding, damage, and reinterpretation. Either way, the image keeps the cloth from becoming merely a dated artifact. It turns linen into encounter. You look at it and sense that you are not only examining marks on fabric, you are examining the gap between what evidence can measure and what human beings are desperate for evidence to mean. That is why the image matters. It does not prove the shroud is ancient. It does not defeat the carbon test. It does not give permission to believe anything we like, but it does prevent the case from closing neatly. A medieval cloth can be explained. A medieval cloth with this image still has to be understood. The body image is quiet. The stains are not. They draw the eye in a different way, darker, more definite, more physical. If the image feels like a trace, the stains feel like an event. They appear where the story expects wounds to appear, around the head, the wrists, the side, the back, the feet. They give the shroud its most immediate emotional force, because they turn an image into a body that has suffered. And because they are so powerful, they are also dangerous. Not dangerous because they prove too much, but because they invite people to decide too quickly. To a believer, the stains may look like blood before any analysis begins. To a skeptic, they may look like paint before any analysis begins. Both reactions are understandable. The shroud has never been viewed in a neutral vacuum. It arrives already surrounded by expectation. By the time the eye reaches the stains, the mind often knows what it wants them to be. But a stain is not a confession. It has to be examined. Over the years, researchers and critics have argued over whether these marks are real blood, pigment, a mixture of substances, or the result of some image-making process that has not been fully identified. That debate matters because the answer changes the entire character of the object. If the stains are simply painted, then the shroud moves closer to the world of constructed devotional images. A medieval artist or maker could have added blood marks to strengthen the visual link to the passion. In that case, the stains would be part of the design, deliberate, persuasive, theological. If they are real blood, the question becomes more complicated. Blood on a medieval relic would not prove authenticity by itself. Medieval makers could have used real blood, animal blood, or ritual mixtures. A relic culture that valued physical contact with holiness might not hesitate to use bodily substances to create emotional realism. Still, real blood would make the object harder to dismiss as a simple painting. And if the marks are something in between, blood altered by time, pigment mixed with organic material, or a complex transfer whose chemistry is difficult to isolate, then the shroud becomes exactly what it has often been. Not a clean answer, but a layered object. This is where the language of certainty begins to break down. People want the stain debate to behave like a courtroom test. Blood or paint, true or false, relic or forgery. But old cloth does not always divide itself so kindly. Materials age, proteins degrade, pigments disperse, binders vanish or change, contamination enters, later handling adds new substances, conservation itself can change what survives, and the shroud has had centuries to become chemically inconvenient. The marks may preserve original material. They may preserve later additions. They may preserve both. The question is not only what they are, but when they arrived, how they were applied, and whether they belong to the same process as the body image. That last point is crucial. The blood marks and the body image do not necessarily have the same origin. It is possible to imagine an image made first and stains added later. It is possible to imagine stains placed before the image formed. It is possible to imagine an object altered across time, with different hands contributing to what viewers now experience as a single sacred surface. We tend to look at the shroud as one moment. History may have made it in layers. That is one of the reasons the object remains so difficult. The viewer sees unity, face, body, wounds, cloth. But the investigator has to ask whether that unity is physical, historical, or interpretive. A medieval community displaying the shroud would have experienced it as a whole. Modern analysis has to take it apart without assuming every part has the same age or cause. The pigment question adds another tension. If pigments are present, they may suggest artistic intervention. But pigment traces on an old relic are not automatically decisive. They could come from contact with painted objects, from devotional practices, from attempts to enhance visibility, from restorations, from contamination, or from the original creation of the image. Presence alone is not enough. Distribution matters. Quantity matters. Relationship to the fibers matters. A few particles are not the same as a painted body. At the same time, dismissing pigment evidence too quickly would be just as careless. If enough material appears in the right places, and if it aligns with the image or blood marks in a meaningful way, then the artistic explanation gains strength. The shroud's defenders sometimes treat any hint of paint as irrelevant contamination. Skeptics sometimes treat any hint of pigment as the end of the case. The object deserves better than either shortcut. The real issue is pattern. Does the material behave like paint intentionally applied? Does it follow brushwork? Does it penetrate? Does it sit where a maker would place it? Does it appear randomly across the cloth? Does it belong to the body image, the blood areas, or later contact? These are the questions that turn a dramatic relic into a patient forensic problem. And patient problems rarely make satisfying headlines. That may be why the shroud debate so often swings between extremes. It is real blood. It is only paint. It is a miracle. It is a fraud. Each phrase is simple enough to travel. The actual evidence is more stubborn. It asks for caution at precisely the moment people want revelation. The most interesting possibility is not always the most spectacular one. Perhaps the shroud was created through a process that combined known materials in an unusual way. Perhaps the maker, if there was a maker, did not think like a modern painter. Perhaps the goal was not to produce a realistic artwork, but to create a sacred impression, something half-fraught between image, imprint, and Relic. That would explain why ordinary categories feel too narrow. We keep asking whether it is painting, stain, print, or transfer, when the original process may not have respected those categories. Medieval devotional culture was full of objects that blurred boundaries. Images could function like presences, relics could be staged visually, cloth could carry contact, memory, and authority. A maker working in that world may have cared less about producing art in the modern sense and more about producing an encounter. This does not solve the chemistry, but it changes how we imagine the problem. If the shroud is medieval, the stains may not be evidence of crude fraud. They may be evidence of a culture experimenting with material holiness, trying to make suffering visible, tangible, close. If the cloth is older, the stains become part of a far more difficult question. How could biological traces, image formation, and textile survival align across so many centuries? Either way, the stains do not speak plainly. They suggest blood, invite devotion, provoke suspicion, and refuse to settle into a single category without argument. Every analysis seems to open another small door. If blood, whose and when? If pigment, applied how? If mixture, by design or accident? If later enhancement, how much of what we see belongs to the original object? That is why these experiments feel unfinished. Not because no one has studied the shroud. Many have. But because the object resists becoming a single experiment with a single conclusion. It has too many histories sitting on the same fibers. The image asks how. The stains ask what. And between those two questions lies a harder one. How many different moments are we actually seeing when we look at the cloth? For all the science attached to the Shroud of Turin, one of its most stubborn problems is not chemical at all. It is historical. The cloth enters the secure record in Lirey, France, in the 14th century. There, at last, the ground becomes firm enough to stand on. We are no longer dealing only with later claims, devotional memory, or trails reconstructed from resemblance. We have a place, a period, a Western setting in which the shroud begins to be publicly known. And that matters enormously, because if an object claimed to be the burial cloth of Christ had been preserved continuously from the 1st century, you might expect its trail to be thunderous. Not perfectly documented, perhaps. Ancient and medieval archives are full of gaps. Wars destroy records. Fires swallow libraries. Relics move quietly when danger comes. But still, for an object of this supposed importance, silence becomes evidence of a kind, not proof against it, but pressure. Before Lirey, the trail becomes uncertain. That is the most disturbing gap in the story, because it sits exactly where certainty is most needed. The carbon date points to the Middle Ages. The first secure appearance points to the Middle Ages. Then, before that point, the record fades into claims, possible identifications, and proposed connections. For skeptics, the conclusion is straightforward. The shroud appears in the historical record when we would expect it to appear if it were created in the medieval period. There is no need to force it backward through centuries of silence. The simplest explanation is that the cloth was made not long before it became known. This is a strong argument. It should not be softened merely because it disappoints romance. In historical work, first secure appearance matters. If an artifact appears suddenly in a particular time and place, and scientific dating points to roughly the same period, The burden falls heavily on anyone who wants to claim a much older origin. But the absence of records is not always as simple as it seems. Relics did not move through history like museum objects with labels, catalog numbers, and careful chain of custody files. They could be hidden, renamed, divided, misunderstood, reinterpreted, or absorbed into other devotional traditions. An object might be known under one identity in one culture, and under another identity later. A cloth showing the face of Christ might not be described as a full burial shroud. A folded textile could conceal more than it revealed. A relic could exist for centuries without producing the kind of documentation modern investigators wish it had left behind. This does not prove anything. It only makes the silence harder to use as a blunt instrument. The gap before Lirey creates two competing stories. In the first, the shroud was created close to the time it appears, perhaps in the 13th or 14th century, perhaps in a world hungry for relics and vivid devotional images, perhaps by a maker whose technique has not been fully recovered. Its sudden appearance in France is not a mystery, but a clue. It appears then because that is when it came into being. In the second, the cloth had an earlier life outside the Western record. It may have traveled through the Eastern Christian world, carried among relics and sacred images whose names shifted over time. It may have been hidden, folded, misidentified, or kept in settings where surviving documentation is poor. In this version, Lirey is not the birth of the shroud. It is the moment the cloth steps into a surviving archive. The difficulty is that both stories can explain part of the evidence. The medieval creation story explains the carbon date and the first secure documentation. It has economy on its side. It does not need a long, invisible journey. The earlier relic story explains why the object's image and aura have seemed to some observers to exceed an ordinary medieval artwork. It also allows for the messy reality that relics often moved through fragile historical channels, especially in times of war and political upheaval. But allowing for a possibility is not the same as establishing it. That is where many reconstructions become too eager. They try to fill the gap with a smooth road, from Jerusalem to Edessa, from Edessa to Constantinople, from Constantinople to the West, and finally to France. It is a beautiful route. It feels almost inevitable once drawn on a map. But history is not made truer by becoming more elegant. Every step needs evidence. And in the shroud's case, the evidence before Lirey is uneven. There are intriguing parallels, suggestive descriptions, and later traditions. There are sacred images of Christ in the East that invite comparison. There are historical disasters that could explain disappearance, but there is no uninterrupted chain strong enough to remove doubt. This is why the gap matters more than any single dramatic theory. It is the space in which the shroud can be either a medieval creation or a displaced older object. It is also the space where imagination does the most work. A missing record allows both skepticism and belief to expand. Skeptics see absence as confirmation of forgery. Believers see absence as the inevitable result of persecution, war, loss, and secrecy. Both may be partly right in method and still wrong in conclusion. The honest historian has to live with the discomfort. A first secure appearance in 14th century France is a serious anchor. It pulls the shroud toward the medieval world. At the same time, the history of relics is full of movement, damage, renaming, and uncertain custody. A missing earlier record does not automatically mean an object did not exist, but it does mean that any claim for earlier existence must be built with caution. This is the point at which the shroud stops being merely an object and becomes a test of how we reason from silence. Silence can be meaningful. Silence can also be accidental. Archives disappear. Chroniclers ignore what later generations would obsess over. Political upheavals scatter sacred collections. A relic might be famous in one language, obscure in another, and unrecognizable after translation. Yet silence can also be exactly what it seems. No record because there was no object yet. That possibility cannot be dodged. The gap before Lirey is disturbing because it does not behave like a theatrical mystery. It is not a locked door with a hidden key. It is more like a missing bridge over a dark river. You can see land on both sides. You can imagine how people crossed. You may even find traces of old supports in the water. But imagination is not a bridge. And still, people keep trying to cross. Because if the shroud began in medieval France, then the story is one kind of mystery. How did a medieval culture create and elevate such an object? If it arrived in France from an older Eastern world, then the story changes completely. How did one of Christianity's most charged relics travel so far while leaving so little behind? Lirey gives us the first firm ground. Everything before it is shadowed terrain, and in that terrain, the shroud gains one of its greatest powers. Not the power to prove, but the power to make absence feel almost alive. If the shroud did not begin its public life in medieval France, then the road backward leads east. Not neatly, not with signs placed at every mile, but again and again, the search drifts toward the Byzantine world, and especially toward Constantinople, the city that stood for centuries as one of Christianity's great storehouses of memory. To understand why, you have to picture Constantinople not only as a capital, but as a living treasury. It held relics, icons, ceremonial objects, imperial symbols, sacred textiles, and fragments of holy stories made tangible. In the Byzantine imagination, sacred objects were not decorations. They were presences. They protected cities, legitimized rulers, anchored rituals, and gave physical form to invisible claims. A relic was never merely an old thing. It was a point of contact between earth and heaven, history and worship, empire and eternity. That makes Constantinople important to the shroud debate, even before any direct identification is made. A cloth associated with Christ, especially one bearing an image, would have belonged naturally in that world of sacred objects. It would have been understood not as a curiosity, but as a force. It could be displayed, processed, hidden, guarded, reinterpreted, or named according to how people saw it and what they believed it to be. This is where modern assumptions can mislead us. We want a fixed label. We want a record that says, here is the shroud, full body image, linen burial cloth, preserved continuously under that name. But sacred objects did not always travel through history with stable identities. Names changed. Descriptions depended on what was visible. A folded cloth might be described by its face. A burial textile might be remembered as an image. A relic might acquire a new story when it entered a new setting. In Byzantium, an object could become layered with meaning. The same cloth might be treated as an icon in one context, a relic in another, a miraculous image in another. What mattered was not always the forensic category modern scholars would prefer. What mattered was how the object functioned in devotion, ritual, and imperial display. That is one reason the Byzantine Trail is so compelling. It offers a world in which an image-bearing cloth of Christ could have existed without looking exactly like the Shroud of Turin in the surviving descriptions. It allows for ambiguity. A face could stand for a body. A folded relic could conceal its full form. A sacred image could be described differently by different witnesses, especially if few people saw it fully unfolded. But the same flexibility that makes the Byzantine Trail attractive also makes it dangerous. Because if labels can shift, if descriptions can be partial, if objects can be renamed, then almost any gap becomes tempting. A vague reference to a holy cloth can begin to look like a clue. A mention of an image of Christ can become a near identification. A relic lost in one place and another appearing later in the West can be linked by imagination long before evidence has done the work. The Byzantine world gives the shroud a plausible landscape. It does not give it a guaranteed passport. What we can say with more confidence is that Constantinople was a city where sacred objects could gather, disappear, and be redistributed. It was a place where relics were not private collectibles in the modern sense. They belonged to networks of power: emperors, churches, monasteries, diplomats, pilgrims, merchants, and eventually invaders. Objects moved because people moved them, and people moved them for many reasons: devotion, protection, politics, prestige, profit. A relic could be carried away from danger. It could be offered as a diplomatic gift. It could be placed in a church treasury. It could be stolen in war. It could be sold quietly when fortunes collapsed. It could be transformed by a new story in a new language. This is the road of sacred cloths. Not a single road, but a web. And in that web, certainty becomes difficult. For centuries, the Eastern Christian world preserved powerful traditions about images of Christ not made in the ordinary way. These images mattered because they seemed to answer an ancient anxiety. What did Christ look like? And could his likeness be shown without becoming mere invention? A cloth image offered a special kind of authority. It did not feel painted from imagination. It felt received. That idea is crucial. If the shroud entered the medieval West after passing through Byzantine devotion, Western viewers may not have experienced it simply as a relic of death. They may have inherited, along with the cloth, a deeper Eastern tradition of sacred image and bodily trace. The object would not have needed a clean written biography to command reverence. It would have arrived carrying the aura of the East. And in medieval Europe, that aura could be powerful. The East was not just geography. It was origin, antiquity, holy proximity. A relic from the Eastern Mediterranean could feel closer to the sacred past than an object made locally, even if its actual history was unclear. And after centuries of crusade, trade, pilgrimage, and conflict, many Eastern objects did enter Western treasuries, churches, and noble collections. Some came with records, some came with stories, some came with only enough mystery to become more valuable. This is why the shroud's possible Byzantine past cannot be dismissed out of hand. A sacred cloth could vanish from one record and reappear in another. It could be folded, renamed, misunderstood, or deliberately obscured. Political upheaval could scatter objects that had once seemed permanently anchored. A relic's history could break not because the object was new, but because the institutions preserving its memory were broken. And yet, caution must remain. The Byzantine Trail is not proof of antiquity. It is a corridor of possibility. It can explain how an older object might have traveled west, but it can also become a convenient passage through which weak evidence is smuggled into stronger claims. A possible route is not the same as a documented journey. A city full of relics does not mean this relic was there. That distinction is the line we have to keep. Constantinople gives the Shroud debate a wider stage. It shifts the story from a French village and a carbon date into a world of icons, imperial treasuries, sacred cloths, and objects whose meanings changed as they crossed borders. It reminds us that the medieval West did not invent its devotional imagination in isolation. It inherited, borrowed, looted, translated, and reinterpreted the sacred material culture of the East. If the Shroud was made in the Middle Ages, Byzantine influence could still matter. Its visual authority, its idea of an image impressed on cloth, its aura of Eastern holiness, these could all belong to the cultural atmosphere in which the object gained power. If the Shroud was older, then Constantinople becomes more than background. It becomes one of the few historical worlds large enough, rich enough, and unstable enough to explain how such a thing might have been preserved, transformed, and eventually lost. So the trail east does not solve the mystery. It widens it. The cloth no longer asks only whether a medieval workshop could have made it. It asks whether a sacred object might have crossed from one Christian world into another, changing names as it moved, while leaving behind only fragments of a map. And in that uncertain geography, one name appears more often than any other. The Mandylion, the holy face of Edessa, a relic that may have been exactly what it seemed, or may have hidden more than a face. The Mandylion begins as a face. At least, that is how it is usually remembered. The holy image of Christ associated with Edessa, revered in the Eastern Christian world, and later brought into the orbit of Constantinople. It was not simply another icon. In tradition, it belonged to the special category of images not made in the ordinary way by human hands. That idea gave it an authority no painted portrait could easily claim. A painted image says, "Someone imagined this." A miraculous cloth image says, "Something touched the world and left itself behind." That difference is enormous. For the Shroud of Turin, the Mandylion matters because it offers one of the most intriguing possible bridges across the dark gap before Lirey. If a famous Eastern cloth bearing Christ's face existed before the Shroud appears in France, could the two objects somehow be connected? Could the face of Edessa have been part of a larger burial cloth? Could a folded textile have shown only the head while concealing the full body image beneath? It is a fascinating possibility. It is also exactly the sort of possibility that must be handled gently because it can become too persuasive too quickly. The proposed connection usually rests on a simple idea. A large cloth, folded in such a way that only the face is visible, might be described for centuries as a facial image. Those who venerated it may not have seen the full textile, or if they did, the language surrounding it may have emphasized the face because the face was the devotional center. Later, when unfolded or reinterpreted, the object might have been recognized as something more. Not merely a portrait of Christ, but a full-body burial image. This idea has a certain elegance. It explains why records might mention a face rather than a body. It gives the Shroud a possible Eastern history. It connects the mysterious image on linen to a world already comfortable with miraculous cloth images. And it offers a way for a relic to remain famous while still being misunderstood. But elegance is not evidence. The problem is that the Mandylion is not a simple, transparent object in the sources. Its story is wrapped in legend, devotion, translation, and political meaning. Later accounts may enlarge earlier traditions. Descriptions may reflect theology as much as observation. A sacred object can gather details over time, and those details can become more precise, precisely when certainty should make us more cautious. The face may have been only a face. That possibility must remain on the table. It could have been a separate icon, a cloth image, a painted or transferred likeness, or an object whose history was later embellished. It could have inspired later relic traditions without being the same thing as the shroud. Similarity does not prove identity. In the world of sacred images, themes repeat because devotion repeats them. A face of Christ on cloth is not automatically the shroud in disguise. Still, the connection remains difficult to ignore because the shroud's own image behaves so strangely. It is not just a body, it is a body whose face has become the emotional center. When people look at the shroud, they are often drawn first to the face, long, solemn, damaged by time and interpretation. Even if the full body is present, the face carries the recognition. It is the point where relic becomes encounter. That may help explain why a full-body cloth, if folded or displayed selectively, could be remembered primarily as a face. Human attention works that way. We search for faces. We build identity from them. A burial cloth without a visible face would be a shroud. A cloth with a face becomes almost a person. But once again, plausibility is not enough. To identify the Mandylion with the shroud, one must move through several uncertain steps. The Mandylion must have been a cloth rather than another kind of image. It must have been large enough, or folded in such a way, to hide a body image. It must have survived transfers and upheavals. It must have disappeared from one historical setting and eventually reappeared in the West under a different identity. Each step may be possible. Together, they form a chain. And a chain made of possible links is not the same as a chain made of proof. This is the discipline the shroud demands. It asks us to let possibilities breathe without letting them harden into fact. The Mandylion theory is compelling because it gives shape to the silence before Lirey. Instead of an empty gap, we see a shadowed Eastern object moving through devotion and empire. Instead of a sudden medieval invention, we see a relic whose identity changed according to how it was folded, displayed, and described. It is a beautiful solution to an ugly historical problem. But beautiful solutions are not always true. Sometimes they are stories that feel true because they satisfy the gaps too perfectly. The most careful way to speak about the Mandylion is to say that it belongs to the same world of ideas as the shroud. Holy cloth, image of Christ, contact, presence, and the authority of a likeness believed not to be ordinary art. Whether it is the same object remains disputed. The evidence is suggestive, but not decisive. That distinction matters because the Mandylion can teach us something, even if it is not the shroud. It shows that the Eastern Christian world had already developed a deep reverence for cloth images of Christ. It shows that sacred textiles could become central to devotion and politics. It shows that an image on fabric could be treated as more than representation, as testimony, and it shows how easily identity could gather around what was visible: a face, a surface, a legend, a ritual display. If the shroud emerged from that world, the Mandylion may be a clue. If the shroud was made later, the Mandylion may be part of the cultural imagination that made such a relic believable. Either way, the holy face of Edessa stands near the mystery like a half-open door. Not an answer, not a map. More like a reminder that sacred objects rarely move through history under the clean names scholars wish they had. A face may be only a face, or it may be the part of a larger image that history happened to remember. And somewhere between those two possibilities, the Shroud's eastern trail becomes both more alluring and more uncertain. In the year 1204, Constantinople was broken open, not by a distant pagan enemy, as Byzantine fear had so often imagined, but by armies of the Fourth Crusade, men who had set out under the sign of the cross, and ended by attacking one of the greatest Christian cities in the world. The sack of Constantinople was not only a political catastrophe, it was a spiritual rupture, an act of violence that scattered treasures, relics, books, icons, and sacred objects into new hands and new histories. For the Shroud debate, 1204 becomes a not a proof. A not, because if a sacred cloth connected to Christ had been preserved somewhere in the Byzantine world, Constantinople was exactly the kind of place where it might have been kept. And if that cloth later vanished from Eastern records, 1204 offers a moment when disappearance becomes historically plausible. In the chaos after the city was taken, relics did not simply sit in their chapels waiting for careful inventories. They were seized, hidden, sold, carried away, gifted, claimed, and reclassified. A holy object could leave one world and enter another without leaving behind a clean receipt. That is the power of 1204 in this story. It explains how a gap might form. Before the sack, Constantinople had accumulated sacred objects with imperial seriousness. Relics were woven into public ceremony and political legitimacy. After the sack, many objects moved westward, some into church treasuries, some into noble collections, some into histories that became clearer only after they had already changed owners. The West did not merely conquer territory. It absorbed fragments of Byzantine sacred memory. This is why so many attempts to reconstruct the Shroud's earlier history pass through 1204. It is the Great Disruption, the historical earthquake large enough to break a chain of custody. If the cloth was in the East, and if it later appeared in France, then the sack provides a believable mechanism, not a secret tunnel, not a hidden order, not a coded conspiracy, but war. War is a very efficient destroyer of documentation. It is also an efficient maker of legends. A relic taken during conquest can become, in later memory, a gift. A stolen object can become a treasure with a softened origin. A cloth acquired through violence can be wrapped in a more devotional story by the time it reaches a church. The farther it travels from the moment of seizure, the easier it becomes to forget the unpleasant details or to replace them with better ones. That does not require everyone involved to be lying. It only requires time, distance, and the human preference for noble beginnings. A family might inherit an object without knowing precisely how it was acquired. A chapel might display a relic whose earlier movements were already uncertain. A chronicler might record what people believed rather than what could be proven. Over generations, the story of possession can become cleaner than the possession itself. This is where 1204 becomes both useful and treacherous. Useful, because it gives the Shroud's possible Eastern journey a historically real point of rupture. Treacherous, because a real catastrophe can become a magnet for every missing object. When a relic has an uncertain history, It is tempting to place its disappearance in the sack of Constantinople simply because so many things did disappear there. But many relics were taken does not mean this relic was taken. That line must remain visible. A great event can explain a gap only if the object was actually near the gap in the first place. Without firm evidence that the shroud was in Constantinople before 1204, the sack cannot carry the whole argument. It can only make the journey conceivable. It provides weather, not a map. Still, weather matters. Imagine the city after the walls had failed, palaces entered, churches stripped, treasuries opened, objects of unimaginable religious significance passing from sacred spaces into soldiers' hands, into bargaining, into transport, into the uncertain markets of victory. An icon might be recognized. A reliquary might be catalogued. A cloth, especially if folded or stored, might not be understood by every person who handled it. Its meaning could depend entirely on who explained it, or who failed to. If an image-bearing cloth left Constantinople in such a moment, its identity could change almost immediately. In the East, it may have belonged to a network of known rituals and names. In the West, it might arrive as something stranger, a cloth with an image, a relic with a story, a treasure needing interpretation. The very act of movement could transform it. Sacred objects do not travel unchanged. They acquire new audiences, new languages, and new needs. By the time such an object reached France, if it ever did, the original context might already have been blurred. That possibility is what keeps 1204 alive in the Shroud story. It helps explain why a relic could be important and yet poorly documented. It helps explain why Eastern traditions might fade into Western possession. It helps explain why an object could appear suddenly in the 14th century without having been created at that moment. But again, it explains possibility, not certainty. For the medieval origin argument, 1204 may be unnecessary. The shroud appears securely in the 14th century, and the carbon dating points to that broad period. Why search for a lost Byzantine root when the simpler answer lies close at hand? A medieval relic culture could create the object, display it, defend it, and dispute it without needing Constantinople at all. That is a fair objection. Yet the Shroud story is not governed by fairness alone. It is governed by the stubborn fact that some evidence points strongly to the medieval West, while other features, the image, the relic traditions, the possible Eastern parallels, keep pulling the imagination eastward. 1204 sits at the crossing of those pulls. It is where a missing Eastern history could have been violently cut, or where later speculation finds a convenient darkness. Perhaps the most honest way to treat the sack of Constantinople is not as a key, but as a wound. A wound in the historical record. After 1204, countless sacred objects had to be understood in new settings. Some were proudly displayed. Some were absorbed quietly. Some were lost. Some changed names. Some may have been separated from the documentation that once made sense of them. In that fractured world, a sacred cloth could vanish from one history and reappear in another with only fragments of memory attached. If the shroud traveled west after 1204, then the silence before Lirey is not empty. It is the aftermath of conquest. If it did not, then 1204 remains a powerful but misleading backdrop, a dramatic event onto which later researchers have projected the missing years. Either way, The sack matters because it reminds us that relics do not move through history like evidence in sealed bags. They move through fear, ambition, devotion, greed, and collapse. They are carried by people whose motives are rarely pure and rarely simple. The shroud, if it passed through that world, would have carried more than an image. It would have carried the damage of history itself. And after Constantinople fell, the road west was no longer a legend. It was crowded with sacred objects looking for new homes. The most tempting version of the shroud's journey is the clean one. A sacred cloth leaves the East. It passes from hand to hand. It survives war, secrecy, danger, and distance. At last, it appears in France, carrying with it a truth that the records only failed to preserve. It is a powerful story because it has shape. History, unfortunately, often does not. If the shroud moved from Byzantium into Western Europe, the journey was probably not a single heroic passage. It would have been messier, more ordinary, and less satisfying to reconstruct. Not one road, but many possible channels, noble families, church treasuries, merchants, crusader spoils, diplomatic gifts, private chapels, relic dealers, inheritance, debt, piety, opportunism. A sacred object could travel through any of these routes. That is what makes the Western journey plausible in broad terms and elusive in detail. The medieval world had no shortage of mechanisms for moving holy things. It had roads, ports, markets, monasteries, bishops, nobles, soldiers, pilgrims, and collectors. It had a hunger for relics so intense that sacred objects could transform the destiny of a town or church. A relic did not need to be understood perfectly to be valued. It only needed a story powerful enough to attach to it. After the upheavals of the Eastern Mediterranean, objects could enter Western Europe with partial identities. A cloth might arrive with a name that later changed. A family might preserve it privately before any public display. A church might hesitate over its status. A relic might pass through hands that left no record because the transaction was informal, embarrassing, or simply not considered important enough to survive. Modern viewers often expect a document wherever something important happens. The medieval world disappoints that expectation constantly. Even important things could pass through undocumented spaces. A marriage alliance might carry treasure. A crusader's household might keep spoils whose origins were softened over time. A merchant might transport holy objects alongside luxury goods. A bishop might receive a relic whose authenticity rested less on paperwork than on reputation, testimony, or the prestige of its previous owner. None of this proves the shroud traveled from the East, but it shows how it could have traveled without leaving the neat trail we want. The relic economy matters here. In the Middle Ages, relics were not only objects of devotion, they were also social and institutional assets. A relic could draw pilgrims. Pilgrims brought offerings. Offerings supported churches, towns, and local prestige. A powerful relic could place an otherwise modest location onto the spiritual map. This does not mean every relic was invented for money. That would be too cynical. Medieval people could be deeply sincere. They could also be ambitious. They could believe, doubt, embellish, protect, and profit at the same time. Human motives rarely line up in single file. A cloth believed to bear the body of Christ would have been almost dangerously valuable. too valuable to display carelessly, too controversial to introduce without some preparation, too powerful to remain private forever. That may help explain why an object could surface gradually, first within a family, then within a chapel, then before wider attention. The moment of public display may not mark the moment of arrival. It may mark the moment someone decided the object could finally be shown or used. There is another possibility as well. The shroud might not have traveled as the shroud at all. It may have moved as a cloth image, a holy face, a passion relic, a mysterious textile, or an object whose full significance was not yet fixed. Identity can change in transit. What one owner calls an icon, another may call a burial cloth. What one community understands as an Eastern image, another may frame as the very sheet of the tomb. The object's meaning could have grown as it moved west. That growth would not require a secret order or master plan. It would require only uncertainty, devotion, and the medieval instinct to connect physical objects with sacred history. A cloth with an image of the wounded Christ would invite interpretation. People would ask where it came from. They would ask whose body it showed. They would compare it to stories they knew. Over time, the strongest story might become the story. This is not unusual. Objects become more specific as they are venerated. A relic described vaguely in one generation can acquire sharper identity in the next. A local tradition can harden into public claim. A family possession can become a chapel treasure. A chapel treasure can become a pilgrimage object. By the time critics ask for documents, the belief may already feel older than memory. That may be how the shroud's Western life began, if it had an Eastern past. But the same process could also describe a medieval creation. A newly made object does not need to announce itself as new. It can enter circulation wrapped in an inherited story, a borrowed prestige, or a deliberately ambiguous origin. The relic economy did not always demand the kind of proof modern historians require. It often relied on authority, display, repetition, and the emotional force of the object itself. A cloth like the shroud could persuade before it explained, and this is where the journey without a map becomes so difficult. Every plausible route from east to west can be used in two ways. It can support the idea of an older relic displaced by war and trade, or it can support the idea of a medieval object gaining authority through the same networks that moved authentic relics. The road does not tell us whether the traveler is ancient or newly disguised. It only tells us that travel was possible. Noble families are especially important in this uncertainty. They could hold relics privately. They could acquire objects through marriage, crusade, purchase, inheritance, or service. Their chapels could become intermediate spaces between private possession and public cult. A relic might remain in such a setting for decades before entering the written record in a way we can still see. Church networks added another layer. Clergy could authenticate, question, promote, suppress, or tolerate relic claims. A bishop might object. A local community might continue devotion anyway. A relic's reputation could survive institutional discomfort if enough people found meaning in it. Merchants, too, should not be overlooked. The medieval Mediterranean moved not only spices, silks, and metals, but stories. A trader carrying a cloth did not need to be a theologian. A port city did not need to understand every object that passed through it. Sacred material culture could travel alongside ordinary commerce, becoming extraordinary only when someone gave it a sacred frame. This is why the shroud's possible root cannot be reduced to a single dramatic actor. No secret brotherhood is required. No hidden archive. No perfect conspiracy. The mechanisms were already there. The world itself was enough. A sacred cloth could disappear from one place because of war. It could pass through private hands because of prestige. It could be preserved because of devotion. It could be displayed because of ambition. It could be doubted because its story was unclear. And it could survive because the image was too powerful to ignore. That is a realistic journey. Not clean, not provable, but realistic. And perhaps realism is more unsettling than legend. Legends simplify. They give us villains, guardians, secret missions, coded routes. Real history gives us inheritance disputes, damaged records, uncertain ownership, pious exaggeration, and people making decisions for mixed reasons on ordinary days. The shroud does not need a map if the world around it was already full of roads. The problem is that roads are not evidence of a specific traveler. By the time we return to France, this tension remains unresolved. The cloth could have been born in the medieval West. It could have arrived there carrying an older Eastern story. It could have changed identity somewhere along the way. The route is possible, but not recoverable in full. And then, in Lirey, the uncertainty narrows. For the first time, the cloth stops moving through possibility and steps into recorded history. Lirey is not grand. That is part of what makes it so important. After all the roads through Byzantium, after Constantinople, after sacred cloths and missing relics and possible journeys without maps, the shroud finally becomes firm in the record, not in an imperial capital, not in Jerusalem, not in a great cathedral city, but in a small place in France. There is something almost uncomfortable about that. A cloth believed by some to be the burial shroud of Christ, the kind of object that, if authentic, would stand among the most charged relics in Christianity, enters secure history in a setting that feels modest compared with the claim. Lirey does not give the story a triumphant arrival. It gives it an anchor. And an anchor is not the same as an origin. This distinction matters. Lirey is where the shroud steps clearly into the light of Western documentation. It is not necessarily where it was made, but it is the first point where the historian can put a finger on the table and say, here, at least, the object is no longer only a possibility. For skeptics, that is enough to shape the whole case. The cloth appears securely in the 14th century. The carbon dating points to the 13th or 14th century. The medieval world had the textile skill, devotional hunger, and relic economy to produce or elevate such an object. The pieces line up with an almost irritating neatness, and history often rewards neatness. Not always, but often. The medieval explanation has weight because it does not need to build a long bridge across silence. It does not need the cloth to travel from Judea to Edessa, from Edessa to Constantinople, from Constantinople to France, losing and changing names along the way. It only needs a medieval context capable of producing an extraordinary relic image and a community prepared to give it meaning. That is not a weak argument. But Lirey also does not erase the questions that came before it. A first secure appearance is powerful, but it is not identical with creation. Many objects enter the record long after they were made. Private ownership can precede public display. A relic can circulate in smaller circles before it becomes famous enough to attract documentation. A dangerous or controversial object can remain quiet until someone decides it is useful, safe, or profitable to show. So Lirey solves one problem and sharpens another. It tells us when the shroud becomes historically visible. It does not tell us what happened before visibility. That is the place where the three major strands of evidence pull against one another. The carbon dating points strongly toward the Middle Ages. It is direct evidence from the material itself, and its medieval range sits close to the first secure historical appearance. Anyone serious about the shroud must begin there, not work around it as if it were an inconvenience left by careless scientists. The textile evidence is more nuanced. The linen is refined, its weave technically significant, and its material character opens questions about production environment, cost, and cultural setting. It does not shout one answer. It can be discussed in relation to ancient capability, Eastern textile traditions, and medieval workshop skill. It keeps the cloth from being dismissed as a crude prop, but it does not by itself rescue the traditional claim. Then there is the Byzantine shadow. Not proof, not a chain, a shadow. The world of Eastern relics and sacred cloths gives the shroud a possible older horizon. The Mandylion, Constantinople, and the disruption of 1204 all create a landscape where an image-bearing cloth could have been revered, moved, renamed, or lost before appearing in the West. But that landscape remains incomplete. It is made of corridors, not documents strong enough to close the case. Lirey stands where these strands meet, and because they meet there, the place becomes more than a location. It becomes a test of interpretation. If you give priority to the carbon date and the first secure record, the shroud looks medieval. Not because medieval people were foolish, but because the evidence places the cloth in their world with real force. If you give priority to the object's unusual image and possible Eastern parallels, Lirey begins to look like a late entrance, the moment a much older relic finally became visible in a surviving Western archive. Both readings have a logic. Only one may be true, or, more unsettlingly, the truth may not fit either version cleanly. The shroud could be medieval, but inspired by older Eastern ideas of sacred cloth and miraculous image. It could be a Western relic object, shaped by Byzantine imagination, without ever having passed through Constantinople. It could be an older cloth altered, reinterpreted, or reframed in the Middle Ages. It could be a devotional creation that later generations sincerely mistook for something far older. This is why Lirey feels less like a beginning than a threshold. On one side is the uncertain prehistory, full of possible roots and lost names. On the other side is the documented life of an object that will become increasingly famous, increasingly contested, and increasingly difficult to separate from the hopes people bring to it. Once the cloth is displayed, it no longer belongs only to whoever owns it. It belongs to a public argument. Viewers come. Devotion gathers. Doubt follows. Authorities respond. Stories begin to harden. And with each generation, the shroud gains another layer. Relic, controversy, marvel, forgery, evidence, symbol. The object becomes harder to study precisely because it becomes easier to use. That is one of the quiet tragedies of famous artifacts. The more attention they receive, the less innocent they become. Every test is interpreted through expectation. Every gap becomes a battlefield. Every mark is asked to carry more meaning than cloth should have to bear. Lirey is the moment that burden becomes visible. Before Lirey, the shroud may have existed, or may not. It may have traveled, or may have been created closer to its first display. But after Lirey, there is no doubt that the cloth enters history as a thing people must respond to. And perhaps that is why the first secure anchor does not feel like an ending. It feels like a door opening onto a dispute that the modern world would inherit without resolving. The carbon date pulls the cloth toward the Middle Ages. The fabric asks what kind of hands made it. The Eastern Trail leaves a shape in the dark that may be memory, coincidence, or wishful reconstruction. And Lirey holds them all together, not as proof of one answer, but as the place where the shroud finally stops being a rumor and becomes a problem. By the time the shroud steps into recorded history, the easy explanations have already begun to fail. Not because there are no explanations, there are too many. That is part of the problem. The Shroud of Turin has never survived on the strength of one perfect argument. It survives because every answer seems to leave something behind. Carbon dating gives one kind of clarity. Textile analysis complicates that clarity. The historical record anchors the cloth in medieval France, while the possible Eastern Trail keeps pulling the imagination backward. The image appears superficial, strange, and difficult to classify. The stains invite both forensic scrutiny and devotional reaction. So what is the shroud? A real artifact? A false belief? A masterpiece of forgery? The most honest answer begins with a correction. It is a real artifact no matter what else it is. That may sound obvious, but it matters. Calling the shroud a forgery can sometimes make it feel as if the object itself becomes cheap, almost disposable, as though the word ends the conversation. But a forged relic can still be historically important. A mistaken relic can still shape centuries of devotion. A medieval creation can still preserve technical mysteries. False belief can still be culturally real. The shroud does not have to be authentic to matter. It only has to have been believed, and believed it was. Cautiously by some, passionately by others, suspiciously by still others. That range of response is part of its history. From the beginning of its secure Western life, the cloth seems to have carried controversy alongside reverence. It was never simply received in silence as an unquestioned treasure. It had to be defended, explained, displayed, challenged. That tension may be the most revealing clue of all. If the shroud was a medieval forgery, then it was not an ordinary one. It was not merely a painted panel pretending to be old, nor a bone in a reliquary labeled with a saint's name. It was a large cloth bearing the faint front and back image of a wounded human body, an object that invited viewers to imagine direct contact with Christ's death. Its power came from intimacy. It did not say, "Here is a symbol." It seemed to say, "Here is a trace." A symbol can be admired. A trace asks to be believed. That is why the word forgery may be too narrow, even if the shroud is medieval. It assumes a clear intention to deceive. A maker who knows the object is false and designs it to fool others. That is possible. It may even be likely in some readings. But the medieval world did not always divide objects into clean categories of art, relic, theater, devotion, and fraud the way modern people do. A maker might create an image for meditation, not deception. A patron might present it more boldly than the maker intended. A community might inherit an ambiguous object and slowly sharpen its story. A relic claim might grow around an image whose origin was already uncertain. In that kind of world, false belief does not require one villain at the center. It can develop socially, gradually, almost naturally. People see, people interpret, people repeat. The repeated interpretation becomes tradition. Tradition becomes memory. Memory begins to feel older than evidence. This does not excuse deception where deception existed. It simply reminds us that history often works through accumulation, not a single dramatic act. On the other hand, if the shroud is not a medieval creation, then the problem becomes even harder. An older relic would need to explain the carbon result, perhaps through sample problems, contamination, or later repairs. It would need to cross the gap before Lirey without a secure chain of custody. It would need to pass through the Eastern world, or some other lost channel, while changing names or escaping clear description. It would need to survive damage, handling, fire, water, transport, and centuries of human attention. That is a difficult story to prove. But difficult is not the same as impossible. The trouble is that the shroud sits in a region where possible and proven are constantly confused. A repair is possible, therefore some treat the carbon date as overturned. A Byzantine route is possible, therefore some speak as if the cloth certainly passed through Constantinople. A medieval origin is strongly supported, therefore some treat every remaining puzzle as irrelevant. Each side can become careless in its own way. The shroud punishes carelessness. It does not allow one piece of evidence to behave like the whole truth. The carbon date is powerful, but it is tied to a sample. The image is strange, but strangeness is not authenticity. The historical gap is serious, but silence is not absolute disproof. The Byzantine parallels are intriguing, but resemblance is not identity. Textile refinement matters, but craftsmanship does not belong to only one century. This is why the most useful question may no longer be, who forged it? That question assumes we already know the object is a forgery, and that the only mystery left is the culprit. It pushes us toward a crime story, a secret maker, a hidden workshop, a motive, a method, a reveal. But the shroud may not be best understood as a crime story. It may be a story about how evidence, belief, and material culture become tangled. It may be about a medieval world capable of producing objects that modern categories struggle to describe. It may be about an older sacred tradition reshaped by war and movement. It may be about a cloth that became more meaningful than its makers, owners, or early viewers ever intended. That is a more difficult story. It gives us fewer villains and more human uncertainty. A medieval forgery remains one of the strongest explanations, especially because the carbon dating and secure historical appearance lean in that direction. But even that explanation must answer the object's physical and cultural complexity. It must explain not only why someone made it, but why it worked. Why people looked at this faint surface and felt the weight of a body. Why the image survived scrutiny, scandal, devotion, and science. Why a single cloth could gather so many forms of authority around itself. And if it was not forged, then we are left with an artifact whose path is broken, whose identity may have shifted, and whose strongest scientific challenge still stands in the way of any simple claim to antiquity. Neither route is comfortable. That may be why the shroud endures. It offers certainty to almost no one. It gives skeptics a medieval date but leaves them with an image that resists easy reproduction. It gives believers a haunting object, but leaves them with a carbon result they cannot simply wish away. It gives historians a first secure appearance but surrounds it with stories that reach toward older worlds. The cloth pulls in opposite directions because the evidence itself is uneven. Not equally strong in every direction. Not evenly balanced, as if all theories deserve the same confidence. But uneven enough that the conversation continues. Perhaps the shroud is a medieval masterpiece of sacred illusion. Perhaps it is an older relic misunderstood by the record. Perhaps it is a false belief wrapped around a real and remarkable artifact. What it is not, after all these centuries, is simple. And that may be the clearest thing it has ever told us. The shroud does not need a hidden empire behind it. That may be the most overlooked possibility in the entire story. For a long time, mysteries like this have attracted large explanations, secret orders, vanished archives, carefully staged deceptions, men in cloaks moving relics by night, guarding a truth too dangerous for the world. These stories are tempting because they give uncertainty a shape. They make history feel designed. But most of history is not designed. It accumulates. A relic does not need a conspiracy to become powerful. It needs a world prepared to believe in relics. It needs an object unusual enough to command attention. It needs a gap where questions can grow. It needs people who find meaning in it, repeat that meaning, defend it, and pass it on. After that, time does the work that no secret society could manage alone. The medieval world was ready for the shroud, not necessarily ready for it as a fraud, ready for it as an object of longing. This was an age in which physical closeness to the sacred mattered intensely. Pilgrims crossed dangerous roads to stand before bones, garments, fragments of wood, drops of blood, and objects said to have touched holy lives. To modern skepticism, this can look naive, but that is too easy. Relics answered a deep human need, the need for faith to have texture, weight, location. They made invisible history touchable. A cloth bearing the image of Christ's wounded body would have been almost perfectly suited to that need. It did not merely point toward the passion. It seemed to preserve its pressure. And that is where a small beginning could become enormous. Imagine, not a master plot, but an uncertain object entering a devotional world. Perhaps it was made as an image for contemplation. Perhaps it was presented more boldly by someone who saw its effect on viewers. Perhaps its origin was already unclear by the time it reached public attention. Perhaps one generation described it cautiously, while the next spoke with more confidence. This is how tradition often grows. Not by a single lie shouted loudly, but by a series of interpretations repeated until they begin to sound inherited. A forgery without a conspiracy is not a contradiction. It is a very human possibility. Someone may have created the image deliberately to deceive. That cannot be ruled out. But even then, the latter power of the shroud would not require every priest, noble, pilgrim, and defender to be part of the deception. Most would only need to encounter an object already surrounded by belief. Once that belief became public, it could sustain itself through devotion, controversy, and emotional force. In fact, controversy may have helped. A relic that everyone accepts quietly can become part of the furniture of faith. A relic that is challenged, defended, and debated becomes sharper. People take sides. Arguments create memory. Objections force explanations. Explanations become traditions. Even doubt can keep an object alive, by refusing to let it sink into the ordinary. The shroud's survival after the carbon dating shows the same pattern in modern form. A result that seemed to condemn the cloth did not end the story. It produced new questions about the sample, contamination, repairs, and interpretation. Those questions did not prove authenticity, but they gave the mystery room to continue. The same kind of process may have worked in earlier centuries. Challenge did not destroy the relic. It made the relic more intensely discussed. There is no need to imagine a perfectly organized fraud when ordinary human systems are already powerful enough. Relic culture provided the audience. The image provided the shock. The missing history provided the space. Later devotion provided the meaning. That combination can create something stronger than conspiracy, a tradition no single person controls. This is where the shroud becomes less a puzzle about one maker and more a study of how belief attaches itself to matter. People do not only believe because evidence forces them. They believe because objects help them organize grief, hope, fear, identity, and memory. A cloth can become a meeting place for all of that. Once it does, removing the original claim may not remove the object's power. If the shroud is medieval, then its greatest achievement may not be deception. It may be endurance. A simple fake usually dies when exposed. The shroud did not. That does not prove it is real. It proves it became more than its origin. It entered a region where authenticity, devotion, art, and cultural memory could no longer be easily separated. Even those who reject the relic claim may still find themselves drawn to the intelligence of the object, the difficulty of the image, the scale of the debate, and the strange seriousness with which one piece of linen has been treated. There is a lesson in that. We often imagine fraud as something imposed from above, a plan, a manipulator, a victim. But historical belief is often more cooperative than that. People help build the meanings that hold them. A relic claim can be strengthened by those who need it, questioned by those who fear it, defended by those who inherit it, and reshaped by those who study it. Over time, the original act, whatever it was, may become less important than the structure of belief surrounding it. That does not mean truth stops mattering. It means truth becomes harder to recover. The shroud may have begun as an intentional forgery. It may have begun as a devotional image that became misidentified. It may have arrived from the East already carrying a confused history. But none of these possibilities require an elaborate hidden machine. They require only the ordinary machinery of medieval life. Churches seeking authority, patrons seeking honor, believers seeking nearness, communities seeking distinction, and storytellers trying to explain what stood before them. That machinery was enough. And perhaps this is why the Templar-style fantasy, or any grand conspiracy, ultimately distracts from the more interesting mystery. It makes the story too tidy. It gives us a villain or guardian when the real force may have been collective longing. It turns a complicated relic culture into a secret plot, which is almost a way of avoiding the harder truth. People do not need to be fooled by masterminds in order to build powerful myths. Sometimes they build them together, slowly, sincerely, with just enough uncertainty to keep going. The shroud became the ultimate relic, not because one group controlled every step, but because it sat at the crossing of several hungers. The hunger for proof, the hunger for contact, the hunger for a visible body behind a sacred story, the hunger to make suffering meaningful by giving it a face. A conspiracy would almost be easier to accept. A conspiracy has edges. The Shroud's history does not. It spreads through devotion, dispute, science, absence, and imagination. It survives because no single answer has fully contained it, and because generations have found in it something they were already searching for. That may be the final irony. The cloth may not require a hidden secret at all. Its power may have come from something far more common and far more difficult to defeat: the human need for a trace. In the end, the Shroud of Turin does not give us the courtesy of a confession. It does not say, "I am ancient." It does not say, "I am medieval." It does not name a weaver, a painter, a workshop, a tomb, a chapel, a thief, a patron, or a saint. It only remains a length of linen carrying an image that has outlived almost every attempt to simplify it. The carbon dating points toward the Middle Ages. That evidence cannot be brushed aside without losing seriousness. It is one of the strongest reasons to think the Shroud belongs near the period when it first appears securely in Western history. The fabric adds another layer. Its weave and refinement do not prove antiquity, but they do show that this was never an ordinary rag with a crude illusion placed upon it. It belonged to a world of skilled textile work, whether ancient, medieval, Eastern, Western, or some route between. And then there is the historical gap before Lirey, the dark space where certainty thins. Perhaps the cloth was made close to the moment it entered the record. Perhaps it had traveled under another name. Perhaps later generations connected it to older sacred traditions, because the object seemed to invite that connection. The evidence will not let us close that gap cleanly. That is the Shroud's real power. Not that it proves faith, not that it defeats science, not that it exposes a perfect forgery. Its power lies in the way it forces different kinds of truth to stand beside each other without merging. Chemistry gives a date. Textile study gives context. History gives silence, then a sudden appearance. Devotion gives meaning. Skepticism gives discipline. None can fully dismiss the others without leaving something important behind. Perhaps the Shroud is a medieval creation of extraordinary subtlety. Perhaps it is a misunderstood relic whose earlier life has been broken by war, movement, and lost records. Perhaps it is a false belief wrapped around a real artifact so compelling that even disbelief cannot make it ordinary. What seems least likely is the simplest legend: that one hidden group planned everything from the beginning, controlling the cloth's meaning across centuries. The mystery does not need that. Human longing is more than enough. An image, a wounded body, a missing history, and a world hungry for contact with the sacred. That combination could carry a cloth farther than any conspiracy. And so the Shroud refuses to say the one thing people most want from it. It refuses to settle the argument. Instead, it leaves us facing a more uncomfortable question. Why does one piece of linen still matter so much? Maybe because it sits at the border where evidence ends and meaning begins. Maybe because it reminds us that human beings do not only seek facts, we seek traces. We want history to touch something. We want grief to have a surface. We want the invisible to leave a mark. The Shroud may never answer whether it covered the body of Christ, but it has revealed something about us. Given one silent cloth, we built laboratories around it, legends around it, doubts around it, prayers around it, and histories around it. We asked it to decide between science, faith, and memory. And all it did was remain still. That may be its final lesson. Some artifacts do not speak because they are empty. Others stay silent because every answer we bring to them reveals more than we intended.